I'm feeling super creative at the moment, guys. So in this video, what I'm showing you is how I've taken a pretty average photo, a portrait of my niece, and I've actually given it a more artistic kind of vibe. And the way I've done that is in Photoshop, and by following along you'll see how I use the path filter. We do a bit of color grading to give it a particular look. I'm also overlaying a texture, again enhancing that painterly quality. And if you stay around till the end, I've actually got a really nice little quick and simple way to really bring pop and interest to the eyes. So guys, without further ado, let's get into it. Hi guys, today I'm going to show you in Photoshop how we can create a much more artistic interpretation of this portrait here. So let's see what we can do here. All I've done at this point is basically just correct the exposure, contrast, shadows and highlights. I've done a little bit of texture and clarity, and that's it. So I'm going to bring that into Photoshop. From here, the next step I've already done because I just want to speed through this, but basically all of these leaves were a bit distracting, the red ones, so I've actually colorized those to be green and actually masked out a couple of them with the clone stamp tool. So now we've got a base to work with. I've also desaturated the green slightly because the green was just screaming, hey, look at me, look at me, but we want to make it more about the model. We want to make it more about Poppy. So first things first, let's just duplicate this layer, and what I'm going to do is actually create a motion blur on this layer, but not in the traditional way you do it with a motion blur, but with a blur gallery and path blur. And I'm going to blur everywhere apart from her face, and initially it will blur her face as well, but we're going to mask that out. So I'm just creating some nice strong blurs, a lot of movement in this image, and we can draw and drag and just keep creating blurs in the direction we want them to go. So that one might be a bit crazy. Let's see if we take that the other way. Yep, that's quite cool. I just kind of want to mimic the way her hair is falling as well. Now if things get too close to the face, what we can do, so we're minimizing that blur, is actually reduce the endpoint speed, which we can do there. Maybe if this one's quite close to the face as well, we can reduce the endpoint speed there. Let's say we're happy with that. Let's just say okay. Now, as I say, I'm going to add a mask to her face so we can actually remove it from around her face. But this will certainly give us a nice starting point from a more artistic look. Okay, now I kind of like it, I kind of don't. So if we want, we could actually take that a step further and just re-blur that. So that's what I'm actually going to do here. Come into my blur gallery and path blur, and I'm just going to take the blur of the hair just that little bit further on this one. Let's dial that back just a little bit. There we go. Okay. And once that's done, we can just start using our mask. So it is a very heavy blur that we've applied so far, but I'm not too worried. We want to go with a brush, and I can control my bracket keys, the size of that brush, and I'm just sort of dabbing on her face to make sure we've got no blur on her eyes, and then we can bring that opacity right down to just work around other areas that we don't want the blur in its fullest effect. And if you've got black and white selected as your foreground and background colors, you can just use the X key to switch between the two brush colors, I should say. B for my brush, brackets to make it smaller, undo that, X to go for the black, painting in. Nice, and keep the lips nice and sharp there as well. Okay, happy with that. I mean, if we want, we can just drop the opacity of that. You can see if we just put it in a small percentage, like 50% or something. It gives the image a kind of glow effect, but it's slightly more interesting than just having used the Gaussian blur, for example, and then changing the opacity. But I want to keep this quite high because I want a more interesting look to this image. But we'll go with that for now, I think. So I want to make a new stamp visible copy, and now let's create a look. We'll throw all those layers away so we can see our before and after. Now one thing I think we need to do is just desaturate it slightly. So I'm actually going to do that with a gradient map, and the gradient we've got at the moment is a crazy one. We want black and white. Let's say OK. That's quite cool. But we're going to desaturate that just slightly. So yeah, around 50% is quite nice. I'm going to jump in the layer below, and I'm actually going to sample some of this dark green, and I'm actually going to paint away some of these areas here where it's just very bright around the edges. I'm almost just painting a green vignette just to make sure our eyes just don't fall off the edge of the frame, as it were. Yeah, that's pretty cool. I might even take some of this blue on a new layer and just dab it in around just to follow through that same color scheme. Let's see if we just create some rather large dabs of blue. As I say, I'm going for a very artistic interpretation on this. I've said goodbye to reality. I'm not too worried about whether it looks real or not at this point. So yep, I've just created this kind of blue haze there, and I'll just drop the opacity of that. Normally I work pretty strong, pretty heavy with an effect, and then drop the opacity right back when I realise I've completely overcooked it. So this is our before and our after. We've got our gradient map to desaturate, and now I think we'll look at actually color grading this image. So one way I quite like to do that is just with using a solid color. For example, let's start with this orange and just changing that to soft light. And straight away we've got a color grade, very strong one admittedly, but what we can do is actually come through and see which color actually works well, and I quite like that ready look actually, and find a color we like, and then we can just either desaturate it directly on the actual color picker, or we can leave it in quite a strong intensity and then just drop our opacity out here. So we can just start to color it ever so slightly, and that's quite cool. I'll often do a double color grade just because I find color grading so much fun. So let's have a look at our curves here. What I may do is actually just create a bit of an S curve. If we grab our little hand tool here, we can see on the skin tones are right around that middle point, and we can actually bring them up. Yeah, that's warming them up nicely, but I don't want it to bleach out too much, so I'm just gonna make sure those highlights aren't going too bright. Yep, that's looking good, but let's actually color tone it, because that's what I said I was going to be doing. So let's come into the blue channel and add some blues to the shadows. Oh yeah, look, see, if we take that all the way, you can see what it's doing, adding blues into the shadows. So we just need to dial that to a point where we think that looks quite nice, maybe somewhere around there. If we bring it down, we're bringing yellows into the highlights, which is quite nice. But in this case, I think we keep going with the blue theme and add some blue to the highlight. If we feel it's a little too much in the midtones, we can just pull that down. So we can have our before and our after. That's quite nice. What I may also do is just get rid of the intensity of how dark it is around the edges. So let's bring another curves in, and just this represents our blacks down here in the bottom, and we'll just raise that up, give it more of this kind of ethereal kind of look. And if I bring that below that layer there, yeah, we can get a sense for what that's doing. So I just want to lift those blacks just ever so slightly, ever so slightly. If you want to, you can name those layers. So let's call that blue toning. Let's call this one curve lift blacks. I always think it's nice to stay organized when you're working in Photoshop with your layers. And let's call this red color grade, and let's call that Desaturate. Turn all of these back on and see where we're at. So what we can do is actually group all of these into a folder and just call that color grade, and we can see without a very realistic in terms of color photo, and then we've created a very distinctive look with our color grade, and that's kind of cool. Now what I'd like to do is enhance the painterly quality of this. So there's a couple of ways that we can do that. Well, there's many ways we can do that, but in this instance what I'm going to do is actually duplicate this layer, which I shall call blur. We will create another version of that, which we are going to call paint. Now I'd like to apply some filters to this, but see the filter gallery here is grayed out. What we need to do is actually change this to an 8-bit image. Unfortunately, even today, Photoshop does not want to run a lot of its filters on 16-bit images, which I find very frustrating. But anyway, we're now in 8-bit, and if I come to filter gallery, which is now available, I can start applying some different looks. So we're going to zoom out so I can actually see what's going on here. And it's loaded up already for me a couple of different ones. I've got dry brush, angled strokes. I don't need 2 angled strokes, so we'll throw that one away. And I might just add a watercolor look to this as well. I will undo that because what I need to do so it doesn't go over the top of dry brush is actually create, using this icon here, a new filter. So now if I press watercolor, that will drop that into there. The shadow intensity, that will often be far too strong. My processor's just struggling a little bit with the size of this image and running these filters, but I know from experience I want to have that shadow intensity at 0. And we can see that there is more of a painterly quality going on already, so I'm just going to hit OK with this. Don't you just hate having processors that are not keeping up with how quickly your brain and your vision is working? Very frustrating. But anyway, sometimes it's just worth the wait. There we go. So we have a painterly kind of look, but it's just far too much on her face particularly. So we're going to mask that off again. So let's create a mask, have a black brush, and just start to paint that way. If I press the 0 key, that'll put my opacity to 100. We can see where the actual filters have brightened up the image as well, which is quite nice. So to match that, perhaps what we could do is create a curves adjustment where we're going to boost up the midtones, and we're going to press Control, click on this mask, and just borrow that mask from there. I press Alt Delete, and that will fill it with my current color, which is black. And now we have a brightening of the face, keeping it all very similar to the rest of the image. To draw our attention more into our model here, what I may do is just grab a curves layer and create a vignette. So I'm going to darken down the whole image at the moment. The shadows themselves, I'm actually going to bring them up slightly, which is going to reduce the contrast, because I don't want us paying too much attention to the exterior of the photo around the edge. It's all about guiding the viewer's eye. So we've done that, but it's affecting the whole image. So again, what we want to do is just mask out Poppy, and I'm just going to do that with a brush. I really don't feel like I need to be super pedantic about accurate masking. I mean, if we look at the mask, that's what that mask looks like. That's what that mask looks like. Yeah, happy with that. Let's apply our color grade, which now I'm seeing it again. I'm just feeling it's not quite working how I wanted it to. So let's have a little tweak with that. That bluey green's quite nice. Yeah, I do like the red. And I do like that blue as well. Let's get rid of, let's just tweak this blue ever so slightly. I'm going to get rid of that mid-tone point. Yeah, so we get a more overall blue look to that. Yeah, I really like that. And one last thing I'm going to do is just add a texture to this whole thing. I've been working hard on creating a texture library, and while I've been traveling around Europe, so I'm just going to grab one of these textures and bring it in. This one's called Grunge Concrete, so I'm going to drop that in over the top, and look at that for a gnarly grungy texture. So if we zoom in, that is our texture, and what I'm going to do just to apply that is just change our blend mode to soft light, and all of a sudden it almost looks like a palette knife effect, or very much more painterly. The problem is it goes over her face, but again, it's not really a problem because we have masks. We could borrow a mask from here, but because it's so quick to do, I'm just literally going to paint that off of her face with one click there, one click there. Change my opacity so that I can just soften it in these areas as well. Maybe on her hand we need to just soften ever so slightly. And maybe come down her arm here as well. Some people like to remove textures completely from skin, but I don't mind having a little bit. So I'm just going to go to 10% opacity and just gently paint that back in. And now you can see, because we've got the texture around here on her chin, that was where we just literally painted solid color earlier, but now with the texture, doesn't really show that we hand painted that. So in terms of a painterly look and creating something more artistic, I'm really happy with that. The last thing I want to do, and I always see, oh, just one more thing, I'm going to jump away from my texture and my color grade, and I'm actually going to brighten her eyes. So how we can do that is just bring in levels or curves. Let's do curves again, and just brighten the whole thing. So this is going to brighten the color in the eyes, and we're going to keep some contrast there, and we're not worrying about the rest of the image because we've totally overexposed a lot of that now and blown it out, but we don't care because all we care about is the eyes. We're going to invert the mask with Alt Delete, and now with just a click or two, I'm going to increase my opacity to 100%, have my brush on white, and I'm going to click on the eyes, boom, boom, and straight away we're getting that punch there. We don't want to go like completely over the whites of the eyes because that's when it becomes very unrealistic. We might want to maybe at 20% just paint over the whites just so that they do have a little pop, but we really don't want to go too far with that. So if we look at our before and after with the eyes, yeah, even that I'm feeling like the whites are just a little too bright, so let's dull those down just a little bit. But the actual colour in the eyes, the pop of those, let's see. We all know that the eyes are the gateway to the soul. Let's change the opacity to about 63%. Turn our color grade back on. Every time that comes back on, I feel it's too strong. So, but that's okay because it's all in its own nested folder. We can reduce the opacity, and we can put that where we feel it works best. Personally, what I'd like to do is actually break out the desaturation away from that folder, because I do feel that the desaturation at 50% was a good thing, and now the actual color grade itself, we can control that separately. Yeah, let's keep that quite high. Let's turn our texture on. Now the texture is quite dominant, and I don't want it to be too overpowering, so again we can dial the opacity of that where we want it. Let's say something like 50%. Okay, and I am going to say that is done. So let's look at our before and after. Here's our before, here's our after, here's our before, and here's our after. Happy with that. Thanks for staying with me, guys. I hope you enjoyed seeing how I took that photograph and made it much more artistic. You may not like the end result, and I've got a feeling I'll probably go back to it tomorrow and think of actually changing things slightly. I always find I work quite heavy-handedly and then normally have to dial things back again. But if you save your Photoshop files, you're always able to jump back into those layers and just reduce the opacity further if you feel you need to. I'd love to know what your techniques are. If you've got some for giving things a more artistic look, what do you like to do? Leave some comments below, give me a thumbs up, and if you've enjoyed this video and want to learn more from me, please consider subscribing. And I will leave it there because somebody's just started mowing their lawn and that will ruin the video. Cheers guys, I'll see you in the next one.